Hello everyone and welcome to another MoTeC webinar. My name is Mark McCoy and today's subject will be how to set up MoTeC launch control. The topics today will be just a bit of a review of what is launch control, but if anyone's watched my previous webinars on these subjects, they'll already have a pretty good idea. Then we go into setting up the individual parameters that you'll need for the function, the tables used, and some advice on testing and how to get the numbers that you actually want to put into your ECU. This launch control is basically relevant to the 100 series ECUs and the M84. First of all, what is launch control? Now, what we are trying to do with launch control is get the car off the start line, or maybe the jet ski or the boat or even snowmobiles these days. We just want to go from not moving to moving as quickly as possible. The launch control function is always based on more or less an RPM limit with relation to ground speed. So effectively what we're doing is we're saying what RPM do we want based on a certain ground speed, whether that ground speed be 0, 10, 15, 20 kilometers an hour. Now, for some vehicles like four-wheel drive cars, getting a ground speed channel can be a little bit difficult because all four wheels are driven, so the wheel speeds don't necessarily indicate how fast the car is actually moving across the ground. So in my second point there I've got in brackets or other. Generally what some people do is they could, instead of basing launch control on ground speed, they might base it on a timer which is started when the clutch lets go. So there is quite a few different ways of doing this. I'll be going through the basics, but the smarter people out there will be able to figure it out if they need something special, or give us a call and let us know what you want to do. Generally the launch control is just used in first gear, although I have seen people using it through first and second gear. This is kind of up to you. I would sort of suggest that after first gear you're probably going to really want to be into traction control, which will be the subject of another webinar. So based on being an RPM limiter based off ground speed in general, we don't actually calculate any slip value, slip being the difference between our driven wheel speed and our non-driven wheel speed, or that's drive speed and ground speed. We're not worried about that. This is just purely an RPM limiter. The function uses ignition or fuel cut and ignition retard only. We don't use drive-by-wire for the launch control function. It's always cut. In this webinar, I've just got over here a bit of an indication of where I am in the software. So if you start at adjust and then go to functions, traction control and setup, you'll get these lists of parameters to start with. This is sort of what we'll be working with today. Now there's clearly like quite a large list of parameters to set there, but we're only dealing with the launch control. Now some of these will be a little out of order, but the parameters I go through are the ones to deal with launch control only, and this is all you need to do for launch. We're not worried about the traction control. So to turn the function on, we actually have to do that in two places. One is we have to turn on the slip calculation mode. Now, yes, remember that we are not actually using slip, but the overall on or off channels for this function, even though we're only using part of it, is one, the slip calculation mode, and also the control method. Now, these two parameters, if you were just using launch control only, it doesn't really matter what numbers you put in there. You just don't want it to be 0. So up here, if we put one ground speed versus drive speed, or even gear, it doesn't really matter for the purposes of launch control only. Same with down for the control method. You'll see there's drive-by-wire, cut only, retard only, and retard and cut. Now again, for just launch, it doesn't really matter what we have in these two parameters. We just need to have something that will turn the function on. The next thing we have to set up is our launch RPM limit type, and like I said, these will be slightly out of order, but just you can follow it through on the webinar if you're ever actually doing it on a car. So for the launch RPM limit type, this is what type of cut are we using, and you'll see each time we highlight a parameter in blue, up to the right there we will have a list of our various different options that we have. Now it's whether we use fuel cut or ignition cut or a combination of both. Now generally speaking, I would say that you would most likely to be using either 2 or maybe even 3. You could also use 5 if you wanted. Ignition cut is the quickest and most reliable way of reducing engine power. So 90% of the time you will be dealing with an ignition cut of some type. Now number 3 here is probably not such a bad idea. I've had quite a few people telling me that when they use ignition cut only, what that tends to produce is large amounts of black smoke out the exhaust pipe. Obviously this is the unburnt fuel, so you know, if you've got a bit of vanity going about your car, you probably want to make sure you cut the fuel as well, so that will limit the amount of black smoke coming out the exhaust. Maybe you want that, you know, completely up to you, but just a little bit of advice. The randomizer is effectively the pattern in which the cylinders are cut. Do we cut them 1, 2, 3, 4? Do we cut them, you know, 1, 4, 3, 2? That kind of thing. Now, this number is a bit of a mathematical background number, so it doesn't really relate to a specific pattern as such. And also, the same randomizer number on a different number of cylinders will produce different results. Generally, what I would suggest to customers is just use either of the two standard numbers, that's being 75 or 151. There is actually 255 different limiter randomizer you can use. Some people, what they will do is set like a low main RPM limit and then just run the engine up onto the RPM limiter and go through the randomizer numbers to see which cylinder cutting pattern is better for their engine. You know, because obviously we're cutting cylinders, we're going to have vibration and the engine sounding reasonably unhappy. If you change these numbers, it can help with that. So, but again, really depends on the type of engine, the number of cylinders, etc. So stick with these two numbers to start with, unless you want to do some extra testing. The RPM limit control range, this one's quite important to understand. Effectively what we're saying is, by having a control range, this is what people sometimes refer to as a soft cut. A bigger control range produces a softer cut or softer limiter. Basically what it's saying is, if I ask for an RPM limit of, let's pick a figure, 6,000 RPM, but I have, in this case, a control range of 500 RPM. What we are saying, at 6,000 RPM, I have absolutely no cut. At 6,500 RPM, I have 100% cut. So what the engine will do is, as you rev it up, you'll get to 6,000 and slowly the ECU will wind in varying amounts of cut until the engine simply stops accelerating. So you might, depending on the engine, you might get to 6,300 revs before the engine stops actually accelerating. So the whole idea is, if you have a nice big control range, it means the cutting of the engine is softer, so it's not quite as abrupt and can make the RPM limiting a lot smoother. But what you have to do is you might have to adjust. If you want 6,000, you might actually have to adjust the main limiter down to, say, 5,800 with an RPM control range of 500. And then when you actually put your foot on the accelerator, the engine will go up and the ECU will wind in the cut until the engine stops accelerating. So you do have to adjust this, and the RPM limit you set may not actually be the RPM limit you get, because we are working with a control range. It is the RPM limit plus the control range is how the ECU ramps in the cut. So you might have to adjust this up and down, but realistically, once you start doing the testing, it will, become a lot less complicated. Another important thing to understand, and this is more for making sure the driver knows what's going on, we have a launch throttle position activation. So effectively what we are saying here is below a certain amount of throttle you cannot use the launch control. Now that's either the launch retard table or the launch RPM table. We can separate the two just in case you want the retard to come in before or after the actual RPM limiting. Now the problem here is I've found that a number of drivers will come to the start line of a race and they will slowly squeeze their foot on to the throttle. Now obviously the RPM is going to go up. Now in this case here I've said don't use the launch until you're above 60% throttle. So maybe only using 50% throttle will have the engine on the main RPM limiter. So then the driver thinks, look, the function's not working. What they need to understand is they need to get to the start line and just absolutely mash their foot all the way to the floor. So as soon as we go above 60% throttle, that's when the launch control will start. Okay, so below that it won't come on. So you just have to be careful that lower amounts of throttle could make the RPM limit go all the way to the main RPM limit. And it tends to upset some drivers when they really don't know what's going on. So the easiest way to instruct the driver is just go to the line and as quickly as possible put the foot or the accelerator pedal to 100% throttle. So that will go above your activate throttle position and turn on the launch control. Basically we have these parameters so that you can drive the car around the pits, maybe even on a transport stage or something like that, and as long as you stay below this throttle it won't bring the launch control on. Okay. The launch RPM limit table. This is ultimately what you are going to tune. What we are saying here, as I said right at the beginning, we are setting an RPM limit based on primarily ground speed or maybe a timer for your four-wheel drive cars. So what this says is you can see my axis here is ground speed, and I also have an extra axis if you want for a driver adjustable knob, but being MoTeC software, these axes can be literally whatever channel you want. So this is just a fairly good example of how I can have the driver change his launch control, maybe dependent on the track conditions. When we're in launch control and we're at 0 ground speed and the driver pushes the throttle to go above the activate throttle position, this table will take over and quite literally limit the RPM to this table. Then the driver lets go of the clutch and the car launches. So the ground speed starts to increase, so the RPM limit changes. So all the way through first gear up to, in this case, 50 kilometers an hour, we are controlling the RPM. So this is independent of the main RPM limiter. This is what is controlling the engine speed. So the idea is to give the engine enough RPM so that our wheels don't break into massive wheel spin or limit it too much and bog the engine down. Now a couple of important points is my table axis here, the x-axis, stops at 50 kilometers an hour ground speed. So when this function or the car gets to 50 kilometers an hour, the function turns off. So this x-axis value, the limit of this x-axis, is what determines when the function turns off. I've said 50 kilometers an hour. Now, one question I get over the phone a fair bit is people are worried that on the track that the car might drop down to below 50 kilometers an hour on certain corners, and they're worried that it will go back into launch control. This doesn't happen. What you'll see here is my last point is the reset. Once you've used launch control and you're driving around the track, the launch control will not reset until you get to a quarter of this x-axis value. Okay, so what we would say is we would go up to 50 kilometers an hour on a launch, the function turns off. We go into maybe a tight hairpin and the vehicle speed drops to maybe 30 kilometers an hour, launch control does not come on. When the driver gets back to the pits, he will drop down to a quarter of 50, which will be 12.5 kilometers an hour, then it will come back on. So you just have to be a bit aware of this, of if you've got maybe a very long first gear that goes up to 100 kilometers an hour, and if you had a corner that was, say, 25 kilometers an hour, pretty slow, I know, you have to just be aware that that's going to be an indication for the ECU to turn the launch control back on. But like I was saying, we generally would only recommend you use launch control through first gear, and then over sort of first gear you'd be using the actual traction control function instead. We also have a launch retard table. So everything previously has been based on cut. When I say cut, that means ignition cut is stopping cylinders firing by simply not firing a spark. The retard is different. The retard is actually based on the ignition advance. So what we are saying here is, as well as having cut to hold the RPM limit at our table value, we can also add in some retard, so we can actually change the ignition advance as well. So maybe for turbo anti-lag, where you want some cut and also some ignition retard as well, we can use this table. Now this table will be on while the main RPM limit table is on. So again, based on my previous example, at 50 kilometers an hour, this table turns off as well. You can just sort of see here that I've got this one based on ground speed also, and I've also got it based on the actual manifold pressure. Another thing that might be helpful is the retard can help smooth out engines that have like a low cylinder count. If you took the example of perhaps a single cylinder engine, realistically you can either cut cylinders or let them fire, so the RPM limiting of a single cylinder engine can be quite harsh no matter what the control range is. So a way of reducing power as well is to simply change the ignition advance, so make it fire at less advanced, which will reduce the power as well. Testing. What we want to do is we are ultimately trying to make our RPM limit use the tyres their best, so it's always a good idea, and I did mention this in my previous webinar, to do some logging of tyre slip based on G-force or longitudinal G-force. A G-force sensor is a nice, easy way of doing this. This is not completely essential for the launch control, but the more information you have, the better. And we can also sort of take into consideration in our logging our corners and our straights, just to get an idea of how the tyre works. Another thing to remember about this launch control is it's better to start with too much wheel spin than too little. The way a tyre works, it's much easier if you have it spinning too fast to pull the slip down than try to slowly edge it up. So if this is the desired slip, our pink line across the middle, what we want to do as soon as the clutch is released, we want to break the tires into wheel spin, some more wheel spin than we actually want, and then quickly bring it down to the desired slip. It's very difficult to release the clutch and try to slowly provoke the tires into slip. This doesn't work very well. You need to be thinking, start with too much and reduce it. That's the much better way to go. With actual testing, logging I would say is pretty much essential these days. The easiest way to do this is simply send the driver out to do a few starts and then simply compare these starts. So of my two examples here, I have RPM up the top, and you can see I've got the black one is higher and the red one is slightly lower. And if you look down at my ground speed, this is actually how the car is launching. We can see that the green one, or any of the colors, are related and any of the blacks are related in this example. So my red RPM gives me my green ground speed, and my black RPM gives me my black wheel speed trace. Now you can obviously see here that my red trace gives me a much faster takeoff, whereas my black RPM here, you can see that obviously the tires are, I've got more RPM, so the wheels are turning faster. So, but the problem here is it's actually producing less grip and the car isn't accelerating as fast. And we can even see this down here on my longitudinal G-force channel. The coloured ones, I've got clearly more G-force, more acceleration. The black RPM has produced too much wheel spin and I'm not getting the G-force that I want, or not as good as my lower RPM. So clearly here between the two we would be wanting to go for the red RPM here. Now just to further that, what I would generally do with customers is tell them to go out and do a few launches trying different things with the launch control possibly turned off. And then what I can do is I can overlay the 3 ground speed traces. I've got my 1, 2 and 3 different tests, and you can see that in different sections each of them have different amounts of acceleration. So by using my logging I can simply overlay the 3, pick the best parts of each of them, and then simply use that as my RPM table. So based on these ground speeds in my I2, if I just go back one, that's going to give me my RPM trace as well. And I'll just go forward. So pick the best parts of each section and use the RPM from the pink one from here to here, the RPM from the blue one from here to here, and the RPM from the green one from here to here, and then at the end we go back to the blue one. So you're basically taking the best bits of multiple runs and simply adding them together. So this is probably the quickest and easiest way to get a very good base setting. And then obviously you might need to take into account things like tire temperature, tire pressures, track surface, maybe it's wet, maybe it's dry. You go to Bathurst or maybe to Winton, somewhere like that, you might need to have multiple different launch RPM profiles depending on where you are and what you're doing. Remember back before in my RPM table I had a driver adjustable knob, so he could maybe have different settings for the different tracks. One actual interesting experience I had a few years ago was a team who told me that their driver preferred to turn the launch control off because he could do a better job himself, he believed. Now there's 2 observations you can make from this. One is, if the driver was able to produce a better launch than the launch control they had set up, that simply means they now have data logging for what is a faster launch, so simply put those numbers in. And the second thing you have to remember is that I can guarantee this ECU will do this 100 times in a row exactly the same, and anyone who's got experience with drivers will know that there's always going to be that one time that they make a mistake, and that's usually at the most critical point, like the start of the race or something like that. So remember, if you have the data, no matter how you obtained it, you can always use it. So remember, logging. It is indispensable these days. Well, thank you everyone for attending. I hope this webinar has been informative. As with all of our webinars, these are being recorded and these will be put onto motec.com.au under the webinar section. And if you haven't already joined, it's probably a good idea to join our MoTeC forum. So if you have a question and we've all gone home for the night, you can put your question up on the forum, and someone in a different time zone will get to that. So again, thank you for attending, and I hope you can attend more of these MoTeC webinars.